Hello, hello, wonderful to have you here. In today's video, what I want to do is to discuss the second jhana. The second one of these four states of deep meditative absorption we find in the early Buddhist Dharma, in the early Buddhist teachings. Now, before getting there, though, I do want to have a recap at least about the first jhana, which we saw in the last video. And I'll leave a link to that video down below in the notes in case you haven't seen it. Basically, in the first jhana, in the video about the first jhana, we heard about how once the mental hindrances have been overcome and the mind quieted to that extent, then there can spontaneously arise this, what's called the first jhana, which is a state of what's described as rapture and bliss born of seclusion. So we've secluded ourselves from the world. We've secluded ourselves from sounds and noises and the hindrances. And when we do this, then this rapture and bliss can make its appearance. Now, this first jhana is an active sort of mind state. There's both an activity in the feelings associated with it, that is to say the state which is known as rapture or piti in Pali, is a sort of a bubbling kind of active pleasurable state, and also the mind is active in the background. It's exactly what that activity is something that's disputed among different practitioners, but in any event, the mind is doing something in the background in an active way. But if we sit with this state for long enough, if we deepen our practice in the first jhana, then its character can change. The character of the mind can change. And we get into what's known as the second jhana. Now, what's the definition of that second jhana? As the placing of the mind and keeping it connected are stilled, they enter and remain in the second absorption, or second jhana, which has the rapture and bliss born of immersion, with internal clarity and confidence and unified mind, without placing the mind and keeping it connected. Now, as we discussed in the last video on the first jhana, placing the mind, that's the Pali word vitakka, and keeping it connected, that's the Pali word vichara. These are words that may have various meanings, but basically they imply a sort of an active role that the mind undertakes. So in the first jhana they were necessary, that is to say there was this placing the mind and keeping it connected, but eventually these mental operations cease. We're no longer needing to place the mind on the state or keep it connected to the state. The mind simply remains there of its own. Or if we interpret vitakka and vichara as more along the lines of thinking and pondering, or thought and examination or something like that, different kinds of thinking states, we might say that the thoughts in the background sort of die down, or at least cease. They would have been very quiet in the first jhana anyway, but in order for us to achieve the second jhana, or get to the second jhana, the thoughts must cease completely. So what happens basically is that the mind has quieted down to an extent that it's no longer active. Now, in the first jhana, what we had were these experiences of what were called rapture and bliss, and they were both born of seclusion. They came up because we had secluded ourselves. In the second jhana, we have the same experiences of rapture and bliss, but they're no longer said to be born of seclusion. Now they're said to be born of immersion or concentration. Basically, they now arise because the mind is no longer being scattered by its mental operations. In other words, in the first jhana we had these mental operations I've just discussed. They have now ceased, and their cessation is a very pleasant thing because it allows the mind to focus more. It allows the mind to become quieter and more unified. Now, there's also an important simile associated with the second jhana, and so what we read in that simile is this. It's like a deep lake fed by spring water. There's no inlet to the east, west, north, or south, and no rainfall to replenish it from time to time. But the stream, or we might say the spring of cool water welling up in the lake, that is to say at the bottom, from the bottom of the lake, drenches, steeps, fills, and spreads throughout the lake. There's no part of the lake that's not spread through with cool water. In the same way, a mendicant drenches, steeps, fills, and spreads their body with rapture and bliss, born of immersion. There's no part of the body that's not spread with rapture and bliss, born of immersion. Now, once again, as in the first jhana, in this one, the simile again says that these states of rapture and bliss are felt in the body. The body is sort of felt to be permeated with them, the way cool water permeates a lake, if it's being spread, or I should say, if that cool water is sort of flowing in from below. And here we have to imagine a lake up in the mountains somewhere that is fed simply by a spring from underneath. So the cool water that spreads, that sort of wells up from below, spreads throughout the lake in the same way that these pleasurable states well up from inside the body and spread throughout. Now, the other aspect of this is the activity involved. In the first jhana, we saw it was quite an active simile, this bath attendant that's kneading the bath powder. In this one, that activity has died down substantially. There still is some activity. We have this cool water that's permeating the lake, so we might say there are sort of very quiet, sort of slow eddies and currents of cool water within the lake. There's some motion there, but there's no really active motion. There's no streams that come from the north or the west or the south or the east. There's no rainfall. All of these very active kinds of interventions have gone away. And what we're left with is a much slower and sort of a calmer kind of mental, we might say, motion. And as we'll see in the third jhana, this motion probably has at least partly to do with the activity involved in piti, or the rapturous kind of a pleasant state, which is itself a somewhat active kind of state of pleasure. Now, it's also said that there is a thorn to the second jhana, which you probably won't be surprised to hear at this point, is vitakka and vichara, or placing the mind and keeping it connected, or, depending on how we interpret it, thinking and pondering. So basically what it's saying is that any kind of mental activity is going to be a thorn to the second jhana. If the mind starts up, if it starts thinking, if it starts directing itself in a certain direction, the second jhana is going to die away. We're not going to be able to achieve it, or it's not going to persist. So the second jhana is basically a pleasurable state that comes from this continuing quiet and unification and calming of the mind, this focusing of the mind once this disparate mental activity has died off. Now from here we can stage ourselves into the third jhana, which I'll deal with in the next video, and when that video is ready I'll put a link to it up here on the screen. Meanwhile, if you're getting something out of these videos of mine, consider taking a look over at my Patreon page and considering if you want to help support the channel and the work we're all doing here. Thanks so much, and we'll catch you on the next video, and meanwhile, all of you, be well.